Hi, this is Adam West, and it's my pleasure to talk about our journey from Eli Lilly and Company's data assets to AWS. So we're trying to make our research data fair, and I'll explain what fair means here shortly, but like many pharmaceutical companies, we had a large amount of data and still do scattered throughout our enterprise. I'm going to cover four different topics. One, I'm going to start with the motivation for why bothering doing this work. Then I'll talk a little bit about a fair approach to the problem and what fair means. I'll reveal our solution on AWS and how we had great success using Amazon Web Services. And I'll sum up with some key insights and our results. So first off, covering our motivation. If you're not familiar with the pharmaceutical industry, it takes about 10 years right now to deliver a new medicine from a pharmaceutical industry. This was a review by the Tufts Center a number of years ago. Lilly has improved our state quite a bit since this review was performed. We're down to about 7 to 8 years right now, but still the cost is enormous. And the duration is very long, especially in today's world. We want to make that time as short as we can, and yet still meet all of our standards, regulatory standards, safety standards, and health standards, of course. Of course, in the headlines, there's many ways to go about this. We often hear about computers being used to solve this problem, such as artificial intelligence, which I sometimes think of as the magical fairy dust that fixes everything. That's sometimes how it's presented. And of course, machine learning and ways that you can use computers to discover these things. And that's all very true. However, as we analyze what are the issues that's making this take so long, what are some of the problems that the pharmaceutical industry faces? This is another paper written a few years back that Lilly participated in that reviewed actual delivery of pharmaceuticals through their pipelines over a period of years. And if you look to the right here, you can see in the later phases, phase one is normally when we're looking at toxicity elements, and phase two is where we're looking at efficacy elements, or in other words, how well the drug will work. You can see the failure rates are very high there. And the reason is complicated of why things perhaps fail at that point after all of this work and money has been spent. But also, I think it's worth noting that phase one and phase two in a clinical trial are some of the most expensive phases, only to be superseded by phase three, where we're going very large scale. So the point here being failures at this late in the day, if you will, after a number of years and lots of scientists and lots of work and money have been spent, to have a failure at that point is extraordinarily expensive. But that's part of the reason why we're in the business we're in. It's very risky. Even though we're doing all we can, there's still a high chance of failure out there. Some of the other challenges that Lilly particularly has, but I believe these to be shared by many pharmaceutical companies, is what we might call the volume and variety of data, both inside Lilly and externally to us. So I have some of these listed here on the screen. Lilly clinical data, which would represent the clinical trials that we must perform to prove our therapeutics are safe and efficacious, are designed in a very proprietary way. We certainly try to follow external standards that are available to us, and yet still the form and content of that information is unique to Lilly and unique to probably every study. Study by study has its unique properties. When we develop clinical trials at Lilly, they're very focused. So they're designed to answer very specific questions. And this brings its own unique set of problems. We don't want to release information, quote unquote, into the wild when someone might be uninformed about what the intended use of the data is, even within the walls of Lilly. We want to have folks understand the proper use of our information, certainly. But this leads to other complications with how do you handle that data. Certainly, we're a highly regulated industry, and regulations change across the globe, and we must respect these regulations and other safety concerns. So that proves to be another burden on how do you get this data collected and shared readily for our use. Lilly discovery data, and discovery here represents all the studies we would do prior to a clinical trial being executed. This would be cell lines and things of that nature, has its own set of complexities. one of which is simply the scale of it. So I use the term NGS here, which I'll explain more in just a moment, but next generation sequencing is what NGS means. And that creates petabyte scale data sets that we have to deal with. Globally, there's been reports in the not too distant past, papers written that make the point that NGS data might eclipse all other forms of data that we have on the planet today, including cat videos, Twitter, physics data, astronomy data. NGS data could outstrip all of that possibly. And it's the type of information that we're dealing with fairly regularly now as a pharmaceutical company. We have proprietary chemistry happening inside the walls of Lilly that's quite complex. Lilly's been around for over 140 years now. Computers have been around for, I don't know, pick your number, 40 or 50 years. And we have a lot of legacy systems that are still functioning fine, some of which are being revised, of course. But there's lots of knowledge trapped in those legacy systems that lie around our company. That's another challenge we have. New modalities includes all kinds of new ways that we're discovering on how to treat diseases in the world. And those are continuing to be discovered. And that creates completely new data that we've maybe never seen before, that maybe the world has never seen before. And that creates new challenges too. And we also want to maintain our high quality pipelines. We have developed internally some very sophisticated pipelines that process information and look for fractures or quality questions in data sets. We need to maintain those. They're, again, probably unique to us in many ways, but they create large volumes of information, but we have to maintain the quality of those pipelines too. And on the right-hand side here, I begin to sort of discuss the world, which as we're trying to discover new insights and understand disease states across the globe, there's a lot of information that's created through literature. People write research papers at a breathtakingly fast pace now, and lots of important information, of course, is surfaced there. We also have to deal with the complexities of biological pathways. If you're not in this business, let me just kind of quickly explain what pathways are. So you could imagine inside of every person, you've got molecules bouncing around. This is the layman's definition, okay? Proteins and such. And we need to understand how those interact because we're going to introduce therapies into a person. We want to know what the results of that might be, but these pathways are very difficult. They're highly, highly complex. I remember one time at Lilly, we were talking about, you know, is this rocket science? And our reply is, no, this is worse than rocket science, actually, because biology is exceedingly complex. There's canonical data from global government institutions such as the NIH and the EBI in Europe that we need to take advantage of. So we're trying to take advantage of as much as we can and understand what the world is discovering. We have many, many partnerships with many research institutes that we're trying to work with as well. And of course, we also want to capture any known chemistry that has occurred in the world. There's also lots of large public efforts going on at the national scale that are interesting as we work on these research problems. There's deep phenotypes available to us, so the complexities of each individual person, and of course, even national cohorts, and understanding all those phenotypes is important to us. And there's systemically a lack of standardization. This is probably just the way it is with research. Every lab can think up its own ways to store and display data. So the complexity is enormous in our space. Here's another slide I think is very interesting to monitor. This is from the US NIH. This just demonstrates one reason why we have so much information available to us. I think we're probably all familiar with Moore's law, and that's drawn here, but you can see the cost of sequencing DNA in any creature, including humans, of course, was exceedingly expensive a couple of decades ago. But now it's getting down into just a few hundreds of dollars. And what that has caused is an enormous availability of information sets now. We can sequence incredibly quickly and very deeply down to single cells at this point. But again, that just creates more information to discover and try to utilize. So our motivation is huge. We're trying to reduce the cost and timelines, and yet take advantage of all the information that we can possibly look at, both internally and externally. So as we thought about this problem set, a paper came out a couple years back. It was published in Nature, and this is regarding what's known as the FAIR principles. So FAIR stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. The Pistoria Alliance is leading the charge with this definition, along with several other institutes, including Lilly. We're looking at these things, but this is our true north. So we intend for research data to be findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there's particular qualities that would lead you to understand, but it's proved to be a very good guiding principle for us as we embarked on this effort to collect all of our data together. So what were the internal requirements for research data at Lilly? Well, first off, we wanted to be able to ingest data, and we wanted to do that from a number of rationalized sources, those sources that we could understand and get to. We wanted to collect also orphan data. So rationalized sources would be, for example, databases that had structured, well understood information. But we also wanted to get to orphan data, and we have, it's no joke, billions of data files scattered about in our high performance computing environment, for example, that are produced quite frequently. A lot of this data probably isn't valuable to us, but a lot of this data probably is, but is lying about in ways that's not well structured. Also, we wanted to go about this in a very systematic engineering way. So we wanted to follow some data engineering principles. We wanted a consistent vocabulary and follow as many external standards as we could as we structure the information. Of course, we wanted to curate and annotate the information as we received it. So curation meaning we want to take a look at it, make sure it's consistent inside of itself, and annotation meaning we wanted to extend the information in important ways, either joining it to other information or line it up to a vocabulary, for instance. Of course, we want our data to be trustworthy and reliable. That goes without saying, I think, but also to develop a consistent set of features. So when our data is assembled, it needs to be integrated in a way that's consistent with its feature set. And we would also like very repeatable pipelines. So we want reproducibility in our engineering and our information sets, scientifically reproducible, but just to guarantee a consistent result set when you go to our data lake. As far as usage is concerned, we certainly want to identify related data. Now, this is more of a cost savings play for us. We don't want to bring in data more than one time if we don't have to. So we want related data to be identified and know how to bring it together and remove duplications as much as we can. We want to be able to, after we receive the data, to be able to locate it based on terms and type. Terms are quite difficult for the scientific business that we're in. For example, gene names, which is a very common thing that we use in our research work, are sometimes hard to quantify on data that we receive from various sources. But we want to be able to search on that, so we have a common way to go look things up, if you will. We also want to have, of course, controlled access. Security remains very important to us. Not all data should be available to every person. So we want a nice controlled system, a nice secure system, of course. As far as usage goes, we set out and said that Python and R are the first-class citizens in our infrastructure. So I think these are well-known languages, especially so in the data sciences field that we find ourselves in. So we have a number of individuals who use Python and R to access data and to analyze it. We also want to surface ways to explore and profile information. So we get data that we may have never seen before and might never see again. So it's important to be very efficient at exploring those types of data sets and profiling them quickly with instruments, scientific instrumentation that it produces results that we can understand and get consistent sets of information out of it. And this is sort of the first step you would take before you do proper engineering on information, but we need that capability. And finally, we were concerned about data governance. So we want to define who owns information. That's an important quality. We want to track the lineage of it. So once we receive a source, we want to know what transformations are happening as you create an end data product out of that data. So we need to track the lineage of the data. And we also, of course, want to monitor and optimize access. So monitoring is important for us for various reasons. Optimization for performance reasons, obviously. You want to get your results quickly and accurately. Okay, so a lot of requirements. He also took some time to think about what types of individuals are we trying to serve with this effort. And we broke them into four large categories. The upper left one speaks of a researcher, and upper right talks about a data scientist. And what divides those two individuals to us for our purposes is the right-hand side, a data scientist, is someone who writes code. That actually is the dividing line between a researcher and data scientist in our parlance here. So someone who writes code like R or Python does so to answer specific research questions. They would be a data scientist. This is like a statistician, informatician, individuals of that ilk, if you will, who go to the keyboard and write code, as opposed to the top left where we have just general researchers. And these are folks who also try to answer research questions, but they do so through applications in general, or visualizations, or reports, things of that nature. So they're not writing code, but they're still thinking about the same types of research questions, and they have different needs than a person who can write code. I think that's pretty clear. At the bottom part here, the operator would be someone who's running things, pipelines, scripts, managing operations, etc. They have specific needs they need out of our infrastructure. And the bottom right is more of an IT type of individual who's going to develop software, create databases, and also build certain pipelines that enable data science and research to happen. So these different personas were important to state out front as we began on our journey to solve this problem, knowing who we're building this for and what they're expecting from us. So those are the four personas we were dealing with. Well, as we thought about how to solve this, we set about in some very large areas of thinking, and I'm going to talk about a few of those here. So first off, there seem to be some obvious, and I say here, easy things to do. Not meaning that they're technically easy necessarily, but I think they're obvious, and we knew how to solve these even before we started. Now, I haven't said yet, but let me tell you about our timeline here. We were embarking on this. We started with pretty much nothing as far as our infrastructure on Amazon. There was pretty much nothing there. We did not have our data organized yet. So we started from, you might even consider it to be a blank piece of paper. And in about 12 months, we had it all constructed. And I'll show you how we pulled that off. 12 months is still pretty long, but I think it's extraordinarily fast given the enormity of the problem that I presented to you. So I think we had quite a bit of success. And to get there, we had to think about this very deliberately in these large categories of problems. And again, I'll go through those here. So on the left is a catalog, right? I can almost say this is pretty obvious. We just want to have a place where all of our data is inventoried. What do we have on hand is a typical question. Someone might say, where do I find this particular study? I know that it happened. Where is it? Who has it? How do I get to it? Those types of questions should be answered quickly and readily. And I called that a catalog as we embarked out here. I thought that would appear probably as a web page, was my initial thinking with it, or some other way. But we want to have API access to it. So at the bottom here, I'm listing out Python and R again, because the thought was the data scientist probably doesn't want to fiddle with a web page, right? They want to write their code and go get what they need right away with a piece of code. So everything we do has to have API access to it as a result. I list out the acronym DWS here. DWS stands for Dynamic Web Services. This is a piece of software that we built inside of Lilly that we're using quite a bit. And think of that as an API layer, a RESTful interface to data. That's really what it is. It has some nice qualities to it. You can dynamically define data sources with XML, so you can quickly get your definitions stood up. You can deploy a Swagger endpoint here very quickly with this system. So that was quite good for us to build that. And we thought we'd want to have DWS endpoints for all of our data. We also were concerned about policies. So as I talked about security earlier, not all data could be accessed by everybody. So we had to maintain some policy levels here with data access. We need a very secure layer of access, in other words. So that's the catalog in short. Dictionary. The next thing was pretty obvious that we needed, so again, easy stuff here, is we need a set of vocabularies and ontologies that we can align on. So this is fundamental to be able to integrate data. You can imagine we have a source A that has its own vocabulary and source B that has a different vocabulary. And I hope it's obvious now, as we work with a variety of data, we cannot control what people do. That's sort of something we have to confront with this infrastructure. We cannot dictate particular vocabularies to individual research centers. We cannot do that. We don't control the world. So we have to be able to take whatever we get and bring it together in a reasonable way. And that's what the dictionary does. It fosters consistency. It gives us terminologies and translation. It enables integration. What we did here was we used some prevailing standards, the FHIR standard, F-H-I-R, which you could look up, is one way to approach this problem that came out of the HL7 work. So we were following some standards as we understood them. There's a lot of work going on at the EBI with OXO and OLS and other techniques and technologies they have in play. So we tried to use whatever we could from these open source freely available devices, but we had to build our own stuff as well. So the dictionary is here to help map ontologies, give us vocabularies and synonyms. Again, source A actually means the same as source B, but we have to have a way to cross-reference that so we know they're the same. Again, in scientific data, it's incredibly complex because the standards are free-flowing. There isn't really one source that tells you what the truth is. Okay, so that's catalog and dictionary. Okay, so then we get on to the hard stuff. So catalog, dictionary might be conceptually easy. The harder stuff was storage and access. So for storage, remember I talked earlier about the different types of data that we have, and some of these are well-rationalized sources. Some of them are just scattered everywhere. We thought of the storage layer as an orphanage, frankly. There's lots of data that has no home. It's not well kept. No one feeds and takes care of it. It's a poor little orphan. So it needs a place to live. And we were imagining that research data would be that place. So we were going to gather lost data, manage releases of that information. So you get a very consistent feel for information as it's produced, and endeavor to make it immutable. So when you go ask for it, it would be the same as if you ask for it later, you'll still get the same data. So this is an immutable data source. It's reproducible. And we were thinking we want to use a variety of storage systems. A lot of these are open source that I'm sure we're all well aware of: Postgres, Cassandra, Kafka, Mongo, etc. So we're thinking we want to have a lot of SQL-like access, or maybe NoSQL access. Kafka there for streaming data, of course. And of course, lots of external data had to be dealt with. So we needed a storage layer of that nature that could handle whatever data we had to be immutable, reproducible, and yet structure it so we could query it rapidly. And then we needed our access layer. Now, fortunately, we had thought a lot about this part with DWS, and that made it pretty easy to get that stood up. But we had to minimize our time and trouble to get data analysis ready. We were imagining vector stores and doing some extensive feature engineering to use this as an analytical base for our work. So that was much harder to work on conceptually, along with storage. One other thing I don't mention here, but I should mention, is even after you have these technical components in place, so you have your catalog, you have your dictionary, you've got a storage layer, you've got an access layer, you've actually got one more problem to solve, and that's that this is all fine, but now I have to operationalize all that and live with it. And we called that the marathon, which we're still on right now. So even though you've got the technology in place, you still have to live with all that, manage it, operate it, run data through it, etc. That's the real hard part, actually, at the end. Okay, so thinking about our problem space, thinking about the requirements we had, what we're trying to achieve, we turned to AWS. Now, I jokingly use this slide because I think this is the way people talk about data lakes in general around the hallways and maybe in the world. It's like, well, you go to the cloud, you build a lake, whatever that is, you sprinkle artificial intelligence and machine learning on it, and presto, you're done. Actually, it's quite challenging to construct this, we found, and it's no surprise, but it feels like many times the headlines give you this perception it's easy to do, and I think it isn't because of the complexities involved. Certainly the data is challenging, but also the technology is challenging too. So this is a diagram of what we actually did over a period of 12 months. I'll explain many of the components on here. Again, we started with pretty much nothing, and we outlined this architecture very early on in our thinking. Now, these parts are not completely novel. Some of them are pretty obvious to do. On the left here, we've got, of course, sources we have to pull from. And on the right, we've got an access layer that needs to be constructed. Now, what I want to mention here is we went about this in kind of an interesting way, I thought. Typically, when you're presented with this problem, this architecture, you might start at the left and say, let's go figure our sources out. Let's get our ingestion layer built. Let's just move left to right through this diagram. We decided deliberately to move right to left. So we started with a data access layer out of the gate. That's the first thing we stood up and built. The second thing we stood up and built was data products. So we constructed data stores on AWS using RDS, of course, which amounted to Postgres and Redshift for us. And we filled those very quickly. Now, we knew we were incurring technical debt. We built pipelines kind of on the fly to create those, but we willingly did that. And why? Because we wanted to show value out of this effort as quickly as we could. So even after a few months of work, not even that long, we already had things coming out the other end. It gave the appearance that we were done, but of course we weren't. We had just started at the other side of the equation and did a lot of sweat work to get it to actually produce. But that was valuable. So we had an access layer, which is a RESTful API layer, custom built by Lilly. We do offer up JDBC and ODBC connections through to Postgres or Redshift, again, provisioned by AWS. And we've got various client libraries that wrap up our API access for Python and R, so programmers can get to it right away. This is all very secure as well. So you have to be authorized to access these endpoints. And we add data products behind that. Now I'm going to jump down to the bottom here for a second. There's lots of components that are needed to properly operate and manage an environment like this. We talked about the data catalog. We talked about data dictionary a bit. Data catalog ended up being an open source tool that we obtained called CCAN. Again, you can Google that for yourself. It's actually quite nice. We're moving towards a more proprietary data catalog now with our work, but we started with that. Data dictionary was a couple different systems assembled together, again, following the FHIR standard, and that stood up and running right now as well. The data asset registry, we also custom built that. That's a place, it's backed by Neo4j. It's a place where we show all of our data assets coming to be in our system, and this is achieving our lineage problem that we suggested we needed to solve early on. So it's a graph that shows data coming into our system and what happens to it as it's processed through our pipelines. That's what the data asset registry is. Monitoring is done through Grafana. I'm sure you're probably familiar with that one as well. CI/CD is very important to us. I'll talk more about that a little bit later as well. We're using Jenkins, of course, to do much of that, using CloudFormation to build our entire infrastructure on Amazon. Our source code repository, using GitHub for that. Binary artifacts, we're using Artifactory right now for our artifacts, but we're kind of looking at GitHub a little more closely now, see if we can just singularly use GitHub and GitHub Actions maybe to handle our binary artifacts. For job orchestration, we're using Airflow, Apache Airflow for that to handle our graphs that we're delivering data through. Roles and policies are managed by AWS, of course. An event coordinator is a system that we had to build that has a state machine inside of it that helps coordinate our events that are occurring. But behind that sits Kafka as our message bus across the system. So this is all message-based, this infrastructure as it's deployed. We're just now starting to look at Kafka streams for streaming data, but we actually use Kafka inside our environment just to handle messaging and events. a more loosely coupled environment then, which I think is architecturally smart. Okay, so I've talked about the bottom section, the right section. The data products are really just databases or S3 buckets. Let me talk about the middle section there. Production pipelines. I mentioned Airflow already. We're writing our production pipelines in Python primarily. These are custom built pipelines. I should say we have external systems that are outside of what I'm presenting here also run pipelines. We're just accepting those as input into our data ecosystem here. The exploratory environment, for a while we thought to use open source tool here as well. We ended up going with a proprietary vendor for this. And that's who we're using right now for our exploratory environment. Again, this is letting us stand up AWS instances very quickly, manage data, manage access to GitHub, and more importantly, persist the workspace so we have a reproducible environment. I think we all know about Jupyter, and we know about our Markdown and our Studio, et cetera, and that's all actually encapsulated in our exploratory environment right now. So we have those capabilities. This is where a data engineer or a data scientist can go in and quickly explore data. They can pull data from our ecosystem here with API calls. They can write their pipeline, their putative pipeline for a moment, and they can go off then and write their actual permanent pipeline and check that back into GitHub for execution later. So that's the intent of the exploratory environment. Continuing going left here, raw data. We actually are not doing streaming data just yet. We're about to embark on that in the next few months. And that'll probably be Kafka Streams in the end here. We have some proprietary software we've written to scoop data off of instruments and such that's feeding Kafka Streams. We have lots of data flowing into our S3 buckets now in very large scale. Seems to be working quite well. So most of the raw data just lands in S3 for us. There, of course, it's provisioned and managed quite well. On the ingester side, we have a couple of devices written for ingesting data. Generally, we're pulling data right now. We think of the left-hand side as the front porch to research data. So if you think about a UPS driver coming off and dropping off a package, the package in our parlance would be the data itself. Then you would, quote unquote, ring the doorbell and say, hey, could you pick me up? And that's an API call for us. And you hand that a small JSON package. And then it goes and grabs things off of S3 or wherever it might be, an FTP site or what have you, and pull in our ecosystem and start the streaming of the data into the right-hand side. So that's all pipelines that we have constructed. So that's our architecture really in a quick overview in a nutshell there. The color coding just kind of represents how much open source, how much AWS we're directly using. We have a little bit of software as a service, but very little. We're trying to minimize or even eliminate such things because we want to keep our overall cost profile as low as we can have it here. Rather be just AWS services only if possible, plus some open source and custom. And yes, we have written some custom components along the way. We're doing that when we feel we need to have a particular unique need that drives us to write code. A lot of this is written in Java if you're curious about that. Okay. Let me just kind of wrap up with a few final points here. So having all that infrastructure is wonderful to manage your data. And I think we have solved a lot of the problems we set out to solve. On top of that, we've also taken time to build some applications that read directly from research data. So I'll just quickly summarize what these are. We call this entire ecosystem our light system, Lilly Insights for Genomics and Human Trials. And this is a suite of tools. So we imagine this being tools fit for purpose, if you will. On the left-hand side, we developed a small application that actually is becoming more elaborate as we keep working on it. But this is a tool to let you measure and rank targets across many diseases. So I'm not going to demonstrate that today, but you can imagine dropping in a list of gene names, and then it will give you small cards of information on those genes. All that information is being pulled from research data from those API endpoints quite efficiently. So this shows you a quick snapshot. If you're a researcher, remember we talked about our personas of researcher and data scientist. This is really served up for researchers. So it's a web-based application. You can go in there and say, I'm kind of curious about this handful of genes, or I was working with this collaborator and they said, well, these are the 5 best genes for disease of interest. Let me go see what we know about those. You put them into this application. It would quickly tell you a lot of public information, but also proprietary data about our chemistry set behind that, how druggable we believe that target to be, et cetera. It's a very powerful device that we've built. Another one that doesn't so much pull directly from research data, but is very much related to it because it uses similar data, is called the target totality of evidence. This also is a proprietary piece of software we've built inside of Lilly, which uses utility scores to balance out different vectors of information about targets of interest. So this is a highly analytical piece of software. A lot of statistics are behind this particular one. And again, it lets you sort of rank order based on rules that you decide are important, a list of targets. A third one we have is called Node. And this lets us, when we hear about certain individuals that are in the research industry, we can quickly see what publications they have, what grants they have, what clinical trials they may have been involved with, what patents they've been involved with, just to quickly get you a network analysis of individual researchers you might be working with, which is quite handy to have. The fourth one is a representation of other applications too. This one's called OncoSolve. This particular application, again, is a web-delivered application for researchers in the oncology space. So oncology has its own particular demands on us. Lots of detailed information from next generation sequencing, for example. Lots of high volume data is challenged here by oncology. But this is focused squarely on that type of question. What can we know about the profile of particular targets of interest here? And this will go down into molecular biology in particular, for example, and help you figure out models, being model organisms, cell lines, if you will, that are important for us to do this, execute this research, and also sort of profile the types of patients that are covered by the targets we're looking at. Another important piece of research for us. C4R is still actively underway, and this is our clinical trial knowledge base. So I mentioned earlier, Lilly's been around for a number of years, and our clinical trial data has been available to us, but not readily available to discovery research. It's quite cumbersome and difficult today to go get access to that information. You may not even know it's there. You may not know who to talk to. And so we're trying to develop a system here, again, supplied through pipelines that would tell you what trials we have, what study designs we have. There's been some NLP, natural language processing, written on top of our trials and our study protocols that would tell you this type of information, like how it was designed, do we have informed consent, what's the informed consent look like for these? In other words, can we use that data for other purposes? There would be summary analysis information available here as well. And lastly, another thing, and this is something we delivered in partnership with Amazon here, is our collaboration informatics environment. So this is a case where Lilly has a lot of research agreements that are live today in the world. So you can imagine Lilly, a big company, a pharmaceutical company, wanting to work with the research institution. But maybe this small research institution does not have the computational capability that we need for our research to happen. And so what we've established here is a very fast way to stand up an intermediate world, if you will, completely on AWS. This would be S3 buckets and any EC2 instances we might need. Could be stood up, shrouded by its own level of security, and it would be established outside of Lilly's boundaries. So it's not inside of Lilly's VPC or on our AWS account. It's on a separate one. And that's actually uniquely beneficial because it's a neutral zone, if you will, between Lilly and some research institution, but it gives you all the security you need and an entire environment on AWS that both parties could access and complete their research agreement. Once it's finished, once the research is finished, we could take that information and bring it into research data, and that's what we've done a few times now. So that was a really powerful instrument we've built as well. So you can see this is a whole suite of applications that we've constructed, and all of these have been built in the last 18 months or so, frankly, at Lilly. So they're coming online extremely fast. All right, let me just finish up here then with some key insights and results. So what have we really accomplished with this effort that we've been doing for a little over, well, actually it's about 18 months now at this point. We've enabled insights for therapeutic discovery, I think is a broad statement, but I think it divides into two types of value propositions, if you will. On the left side is we've enabled technology. I mentioned earlier, we hadn't really gotten into AWS much at all when we started this journey, but now we're heavily into AWS and know it quite well and are enjoying ourselves there, I think, really. very well. It's a wonderful platform to work with. Love Bodo 3, guys. Thank you for that. It's terrific. We have a loosely coupled architecture, which is by design. I mentioned Kafka was our message broker in behind it. We're using Docker for all our deployments, and that gives us a nice loosely coupled extensible architecture. We have controlled systems and terminologies and ontologies in place. So we're interoperable because we've taken that language problem, terminology problem, and isolated it and created a device that handles that problem. We have full CI/CD automation. So initially we were deploying the entire infrastructure when we had releases, quite burdensome, you could imagine. It was all with CloudFormation and Jenkins, et cetera. But now we've got end-to-end automation with Jenkins, CloudFormation, Grafana, GitHub, and Artifactory. Together, we can deploy fixes, hot fixes, every day if we wanted to now. We really do have continuous integration, continuous deployment now. And that's quite effective when we have changes happening. The other innovation I think we have is this RESTful data APIs used to deliver all of our data products. So it's secure and it's in this common parlance, so it's very accessible through whatever your language might be. As I said, we've written special libraries for R and Python. So technically we achieved quite a bit here, and it's great to see. On the right-hand side, we also delivered some real value to scientific innovation. So we have cloud-based omics workflows. The pipelines for omics, this is the NGS workflows, by the way, are running on a third-party application, but the results of that are coming into research data. So we have an end-to-end integrated workflow from naive source data all the way through to end results and filtered information for use in research. So that was a nice simplification play. We've got modality-centric approach here. So we have different types of modality in play, but we're orchestrating workflows, delivering common reusable data products. Thinking about, one of our examples was we had delivered some chemistry information for one particular use case last year, but we built it in a way that we could use it for the next use case. And that's actually one of the powers of having your data centralized in an ecosystem like this. So once it surfaces, you'll notice it. And if someone else asks for, hey, do you have Kimball or do you have Drug Bank? We'll say, yes, we do. It's in our catalog. Here it is. You can go get it. And hopefully you might use it as it is. Or if not, you can make a small tweak to it and get more value out of it. So this idea of orchestrating workflows, delivering common data products is quite powerful for scientific research. We've also got a very biology-centric view of our data here. So another powerful thing about precision insights that we can have. And we've built some systems specific to solve unique therapeutic questions. In this case, a very neurocentric set of information is pulled together rapidly and delivered quickly to an end consumer. So at the bottom, you can see we've had benefits that reward over time. We started with just having improved visibility, consistency of data assets early on. We began to reduce data wrangling, and we're still on this journey. I don't want to make it sound like we're finished. I think this is a marathon race that we're in, not a sprint around a track, but we have a long journey to go on. But we are, over time now, reducing the cost of wrangling data. We're unlocking new data as a result, getting data in play for research that wasn't available before. Of course, we're enhancing and expediting analysis as a result. I showed some of the applications we've built in front of research data. Reducing our costs, we're fully automated, running with a small team. We intend to make our team even smaller to continue to support this over time because from the outset, we built everything in an automated fashion, as much as automated as possible, all in code as much as possible. We've increased productivity and collaboration. I talked about our collaboration informatics area where that was achieved, hopefully also achieving productivity as a result. And in the end, we're accelerating portfolio decision-making. I started off to talk about the high cost of making decisions and how failure late in time is quite costly. We're trying to get those decisions made sooner and sooner in our development to reduce the loss here and also to get medicines to patients much faster. So we had a lot of bold aspirations, but I think we achieved real results, and we did so in 12 months. So number one, we delivered over 80 data products and over 100 data endpoints in this time frame. This number is actually from about 6 months ago. I think we're well over 200 data products now, and we have several hundred endpoints at this juncture. As I said before, automation was very important to us. So 100% of our infrastructure is automated. Every bit of it is in code. We can deliver all of that to AWS using CloudFormation and other things, and Jinx, et cetera, and fully tested all the way to production. We have now hundreds of users. We recently ran the analytics on how much our endpoints are being accessed, and there's thousands of access happening all the time right now. So that's quite encouraging to see. We've got many apps deployed. I only showed you a few. There's actually more in development right now. And this led to, I think we can claim this quite safely, there actually is quite a savings on storage that I'm not going to tell you the vendor we were using before for storage, but quite expensive multi-million-dollar hardware was in play that we now no longer need. And we're paying now as we need it, at the scale we need it, which I think is one of the propositions that makes Amazon so valuable to us. So I think we have very good results to show right now, and we're continuing to work on this problem over the next year or so. All right, well, thank you very much for your time.